there are some men who have an air of destiny about them. For Africans, Nigerians like us, we hear different tales of legends, we hear folklore, and we hear of heroes past. And one of the things that many of these stories have in common is they carry a fantastical thread that makes us believe, or tries to make us believe anyway, that the hero of these stories were destined to be heroes. And therefore, whatever it is that happened to them on their way to their eventual heroic deeds was not by accident. One of the things that they tell us is that some of these heroes have to go through trying times. But a lot of the time, we hear these stories after they have happened. We hear the story of the hero after he has ascended the throne, or after he has gone through his trials and overcome his trials. But for some of us, we were there to see the trial. And we can tell you that it was not as glamorous as the simple summary that the folklore tries to give us. Ladies and gentlemen, and dear listeners and watchers of the Fhtf podcast, welcome to this episode where we talk about one of the events that shaped Nigeria's history, and it is President Olusegun Obasanjo being released from prison. President Olusegun Obasanjo was Nigeria's military head of state from 1976 to 1979. And then later, as we all know, he became the president of Nigeria in 1999 and served until 2007 in the same capacity. However, while he was still in the military, and he was a fine military man at that, just an aside, this is one thing I like about our men in the military, at least in those days, they were just classically sharp. They always looked the part. When he was in the military, in the late 19, well, first of all, before I even run down the things that he was able to accomplish, there is a reason that President Obasanjo was highly regarded, highly sought after, and watched with a keen eye during his time as an officer. It is because throughout Nigeria's history, he has never played a simple or a throwaway role. He has always been in the thick of it. And so we'll run down through some of those roles. While he was in the military in the late 1960s, he played a major role in combating Biafran separatists during the Nigerian Civil War. In fact, he was one of the people who accepted the surrender of the Biafran forces in 1970. Um, Also, while he was in the military, he was appointed the rear commander of Muritala Mohammed's 2nd Division, which was operating in the midwestern part of Nigeria, out of Ibadan at the time. And he was responsible for ensuring the supply of the division. Now, for people who know how the military works, one of the most important parts of the military is logistics and supply. To make sure that food gets to the soldiers, to make sure that ammunition gets to the soldiers, to make sure that energy gets to them, to make sure that the correspondence goes in and out. It is not a tiny job, it is not a small job, it is a job that is given to somebody that is of serious importance, because once that breaks down, a military unit is basically lost in the middle of nothing. So it's a big role. When Murtala Muhammad was assassinated, a Supreme Military Council came in and took power. And it was Obasanjo that was appointed as the head of state to continue Murtala Muhammad's policies. And this is interesting because when the coup that took out Murtala Muhammad was done, a junta was established, of which Obasanjo was a part of, despite the fact that he was one of the people in Murtala Muhammad's circle. In fact, there are pictures that show where he was in security briefings with General Murtala Muhammad. When he got into power in 1979, he tried to do a lot of peace building, bridge building. He tried to do a lot of coming together in Nigeria. And one of the ways that he established his goodwill as far as this is concerned is he actually did transfer control to an elected president in Shehu Shagari when he was done. When he did that, he retired. Technically, when you think of it, it makes sense. When you are the head of state, that's the highest rank you can get to. You don't leave as the head of state and then go back as chief of army staff or as a commandant somewhere. There's nothing else to do. You've gotten to the top of the top. And so you retire. And he retired to his farm in Rhtr, in Ogun State. And he went there to rest. It was a well-earned retirement. But here's why this is interesting. Over 2.5 decades, Obasanjo had shown that there was no military or civilian government that came into Nigeria that did not find a place for him, a role for him, or was not constituted by him and people that were allies of him. In other words, had you been somebody at the time who had interest in taking the reins of Nigeria, the mere presence of Obasanjo was a threat to it. His mere existence was a problem. Then came the Abacha years. It turns out that despite his retirement, Obasanjo had voiced concern when Babangida had taken over that he did not believe that Babangida was ready to step down and let go of the reins of power in Nigeria. Like I said, whenever you were going to take power in Nigeria, Obasanjo's voice would just seem too heavy to ignore. And he was lending his voice to it. As a matter of fact, Obasanjo, along with Anthony Enahoro, launched the Association for Democracy and Good Governance in Nigeria. And they even had a meeting with political allies and people that they were trying to bring up in the new democratic Nigeria in Rhtr in 1993. Obviously, we know what happened in 1993. There was an election, June 12th. Abiola won, but Babangida annulled the election, and then there was chaos. Babangida decided to relinquish and then set up an interim government with Ene, but then General Sani Abacha took over. Now, here is where it gets interesting. Obasanjo had made a remark about General Abacha, and even though does not come from, even though the second remark doesn't come from Obasanjo, I will mention it after I mention Abacha's remark. Of Sani Abacha, Obasanjo says, General Sani Abacha reminds one of a man who, with other do-gooders, proposed a meal for the blind man. As soon as the others turned their back, this seemingly good Samaritan went back to snatch the pot of soup from the blind man for himself. Again, most of us Nigerians, as spectators, applauded. Under all sorts of excuses, there was no shortage of partakers in the meal, and they were not troubled by the moral implications. Those were Obasanjo's words on Sani Abacha, on the coup of Sani Abacha in 1994. The second remark I want to make, and I will paraphrase a bit, was made by Atiku Abubakar in one of his books, where he said that General Sani Abacha was the most unassuming man in the military, and he gave off the vibe of somebody who had no ambition at all, but somehow rose to the highest point of power. Why I say this is this. It seems as though, from Obasanjo's words and from the words I just mentioned from Atiku Abubakar, there was little inclination that Abacha had the ambition to become the leader of Nigeria. But he did, and he became the leader of Nigeria. And when he became the leader of Nigeria, Obasanjo, being alive and being vocal, was the problem. So, Sani Abacha did the normal thing that somebody in his position would do. He tried to consolidate his power in the military. He tried to make the people that were civilians his friends, and then he tried to make sure that the military had people that were loyal to him. When he did that, he decided to send a message to Obasanjo to meet with him and work with him. Obviously, working with him was a way to legitimize his government. Obasanjo refused. For those people who have read books like 48 Laws of Power, that's a mistake. You don't refuse a man like that, not in that position. But Obasanjo refused because, on his principles, this was not the way Nigeria was supposed to be going. Then Obasanjo went forward to warn Nigeria that if we continue along those lines, we risk having another civil war. He then went on to form another organization with Yaradua, the senior Yaradua, another president, the elder, which was National Unity Promoters. And it was a group that was dedicated to preventing the outcome of another civil war. At this point, it may seem as though we are giving a very rose tinted account of the Obasanjo story. But like I said at the start of the show, some people are just like that. And when you are telling their stories, it seems like there's a fantastical thread with which it works. And so we'll keep telling it like that. He warned Nigerians about this, but his warnings fell on deaf ears. Or, in other words, I should say, his warnings could not do anything because he went as far as even attending United Nations Summit in Denmark and repeating these warnings and saying that Nigeria was on the brink of collapse. We were playing with fire. Basically, all of these things that he was doing was putting the Nigerian administrator at the time, General Sani Abacha, under some serious stress. And so, General Sani Abacha asked for the arrest of Olusegun Obasanjo. Uh, they arrested him in his home in Rhtr, and in order to arrest him, the official charge was that he was implicated in a coup attempt against General Sani Abacha. Now, it is very interesting that there was a key witness in this particular issue, a Colonel RSB Bello Fadile, and eventually he opened up and confessed that Obasanjo had nothing to do with the coup attempt against Abacha, even though there was a coup attempt against Abacha. On July 14th of 1995, the court sentenced Obasanjo to 25 years in prison. Yaradua and 14 others that were also accused of being in the conspiracy were sentenced to death. Eventually, Abacha later commuted their sentences to imprisonment and reduced Obasanjo's sentence to 15 years. So he was to spend 15 years in prison. Prison didn't start too good. I should use that term for Obasanjo. He spent the first 4 months in Ikoyi, and then, according to him, while he was there, he was chained up in solitary confinement. But eventually, he was transferred to Kirikiri prison. And even there, he claimed it was unsanitary and it was not befitting. He even said in his words that he would not wish it on his worst enemy. Now, at this point, I should just make a small comment, which is that when you have a man such as Olusegun Obasanjo, you do not imprison him like you do a common criminal because he's a person of particular concern. You give him the respect he deserves. And eventually, that happened. While they dealt with the co-conspirators of the coup in different locations, they eventually sent Obasanjo to a much more befitting confinement, and he was allowed his Bible and the Quran, and he was also allowed other books eventually, so he could start to write letters and he could start to pen his thoughts down. As somebody who is of his status and importance. In prison, Obasanjo became a born again Christian. This is an interesting part of the story because he did not just become a born again Christian, he became a practicing born again preaching Christian. And he started, for want of a better word, a ministry of his own. And he went there and he would write letters commending people in Jesus' name. While he was there, he found out that his friend Yaradua passed on. That must have been disheartening for him. And the way he had passed on was through poison. That would have put some fear in him because, like we said on another episode of this podcast, the years when Abacha ruled Nigeria, those years were littered with several inexplicable deaths. Because of the kind of person that Obasanjo was and because of the kind of things he had done, there were calls left, right, and center for his release. People as important as Nelson Mandela and Pope John Paul II actually called for his release. International organizations, left and right, asked that he should be taken out. And to push the point home, he was receiving international awards while in prison for his bravery and his commitment to democracy and good governance in Nigeria. It was a fantastic thing. Mm, as we know, General Sani Abacha eventually died in office. Mysteriously, he passed on. And when he passed on, a military administrator called General Abdusalam Abubakar was given the reins of Nigeria for 6 months. And one of the first things he did was get Obasanjo out of prison. Now, why is this important? This is important because Obasanjo coming out of prison basically brought him back from the retirement which he had gone through earlier in his life. Nigerians overwhelmingly had drawn a parallel between Obasanjo and Nelson Mandela and said, this is a sign that you are meant to help this country enter into its next phase. When Obasanjo came out of prison, he traveled to South Africa and the United Kingdom and the United States and had to go through medical treatment because while he was held in prison, several reports came out that he had several medical complications, including complications with diabetes, that were not properly treated. Eventually, as we all know, President Olusegun Obasanjo won the elections in 1999 and became Nigeria's democratically elected president and the first of the Fourth Republic of Nigeria. His release from prison marks a day that Nigerians almost eulogize as the day that we also came out of the prison of authoritative rule. In fact, the fact that President Obasanjo was once a military ruler and came out of prison a civilian seemed pseudo-biblical in its interpretation. And the rest, as they say, is history. He was a president, depending on who you ask, he was a good president or a bad president. But he was a great man for Nigeria. And this is the thing. There is no story of Nigeria that you are going to tell, none at all, that will not include the name Olusegun Obasanjo. If you tell a story of Nigeria under military rule, his name comes up. If you tell a story of Nigeria under civilian rule, his name comes up. If you tell a story of Nigeria and creating leaders, his name comes up. If you tell a story of Nigeria and our participation in the international community, his name comes up. Basically, this is one character that has his story properly intertwined with Nigeria's destiny. Many people will tell you that he was the most democratically accepted president in Nigeria's history. The elections that brought him to power saw widespread acceptance in northern Nigeria, western Nigeria, and eastern Nigeria. He was Nigeria's president through and through. And he is one of those people whose stories will continue to fascinate and, of course, more than fascinate, it would encourage a lot of young Nigerians. Thank you for being with us on this episode. See you next time.